All right, everybody. Welcome to this week's lecture. And this week we are going to be talking a little bit more about soil genesis and formation and the processes that kind of shape that. So first off, let's review. So we have the 5 soil forming factors, which we have our wonderful acronym CLORPT to remember. Now, just as a reminder, CLORPT, the CL stands for climate, the O stands for organisms, R stands for relief, or another word for topography, the slopes, etc. P stands for parent material, and T stands for time. Now remember, we also have this ... there, which is other things that we kind of leave that as other potential factors to be incorporated. Things like humans, for example, and how we treat soils might also be a soil forming factor. So we have all of these different factors, and we want to figure out what are their specific effects on soil. Now remember back when I talked about the 12 USDA soil orders, there were some that I said had dominant effects on specific soil orders. So how did we figure that out? Well, to do that, we use something called sequences. And so what we do is we let one soil forming factor vary, and we let it change, and we try to hold the others constant, or we try and keep them consistent, and we go out and study them to kind of look at the isolated effects of each of these soil forming factors. So the first one, climate, we aptly name that a climosequence. So as this piece over here denotes, we look at the effect of climate while holding all of these other things constant, or not letting them vary as best we can, at least. Nothing's ever perfect. For organisms, we call that a biosequence. So similarly, we hold that O constant, let that O vary, and then hold all of these other soil forming factors constant. For relief or topography, we call that a toposequence. For parent material, we call that a lithosequence, litho coming from lithography, the underlying geologic material for the soil. And then we have time, which is a chronosequence. And again, that means that we are holding all of these other things constant and just letting that one soil forming factor vary. So there are a couple really famous and notable examples because they work really well, and we have kind of stumbled upon these ways of isolating for these specific factors, just using natural variation in the landscape. So the first one is called the Franz Joseph chronosequence. So remember, it's a chronosequence, so that means we are looking at the effect of time or age on soil formation. So this is a glacier that's in New Zealand, and it has been retreating at a pretty consistent pace. And so what happens is, as this glacier here moves further and further up the valley, we get soil here that is now starting to have forming factors happen to it, and we know its age. So as we come down the valley here, soil age is increasing. So this glacier is melting every year with climate change, and so we have ages ranging from 2 years all the way up to 120,000 years, which was where the last glaciation in New Zealand. So this gives us a really good opportunity to look at the effects of time on soil formation. So people go out here all the time and are sampling, and this particular chronosequence is super well characterized. As you can imagine, it's also probably not too awful to go and visit this, so people are pretty eager to go out and do some soil sampling here. Another one is they're called the Sierra Nevada transects, so just the Sierra transects. Now these are particularly interesting because there's a couple things going on at the same time. So for those of you who don't know, in California we have the Sierra Nevada mountain range here, and they're pretty tall mountains. They're several thousand feet. So as you go up in elevation, you get certain changes in the biology here. So down in the valley floor, you have grasslands, slowly move up into different pine and different conifers, and then eventually you get above the tree line. And so it gives us this nice transect. So two things changing at once in this. So it's a biosequence because we have different species, different organisms that might be changing it, but those are kind of intermixed and tangled up with the topography here. So as you go up here, you get different rainfall amounts in different forms. As you can imagine, at the top, it might be snow, whereas in the middle, we get more rain, and then down here, less rain. So that's a biotopo sequence. However, we also have different parent materials, different geologic depositional environments that happen here. So up in the north here, we have more basaltic soil minerals. Then in the middle, we have andesitic. Those are more volcanic. And then down at the bottom, we have granite. So what this lets us do is it lets us look at the effects of both lithography, or the parent material, as well as the organisms and topography in each of these. So, for example, if we wanted to go here and we wanted to look at the effect of parent material or litho sequence, we could go just take soil samples, for example, from all of the ponderosa pine spots. So we could take from the ponderosa pine here in the granite parent material. Then we could go here to the andesitic and take from the ponderosa pine, and similarly up to the basalt. And we can look at those and we can say, okay, these are completely different parent materials, but they have the same topographies and they have the same biology going on here, or at least the same dominant species. So then we can say the effects that we see are because of parent material. Similarly, if we were to just look in, say, the andesitic parent material, we can say, as we go up here and we look at different soil factors, or sorry, different soil traits as we move up, we can say, these are the effect of both biology and topography. Those two are kind of intermixed here. So it gives us a really effective way of looking at several things all at once. And these transects, as you might imagine, have been well studied and well characterized. So in these sequences, we want to look at several soil forming processes, and there's 4 of them. So the first one is addition. So addition's pretty straightforward. We think of soil as a closed, or not as a closed system, but as a system with boundaries on it. And when we put those boundaries on it, things can come into it. So for example, dust or plants can die and leave organic matter at the top. People can place a fertilizer on there. You have erosion and the soil gets deposited on the top of another soil. And so those are additions. You can see here, for example, this is a big dust storm. So clearly when that goes across this landscape, it's going to leave another layer on top of this. So that would be an addition. Now, of course, if we have addition, that means that we also have losses. So losses are things like leaching of solutes from the soil profile, or erosion by wind and water, right? So this dust storm that is happening is an addition to this stuff, to this soil that might be right here, but it's a loss from the soil that was where it originated from. So these two things, are kind of in tension with one another and going back and forth. We also have translocation. Now, translocations are movements within the soil profile. So there are a couple different names that we have for this. So we have eluviation, which is when things are leaving one area, and then we have illuviation, which is when it's accumulating in another area. So this is an example here. When you look in a soil horizon, this right here is a zone of eluviation. Things have left there, but they just moved to down here. This is the zone of illuviation. So what's happened here is all of the soil minerals that give soil pigment here have moved down here. So no pigment left here. Soil minerals have eluviated here and illuviated it here. So you can see that it has this bright reddish color. So there's examples like, for example, again, dust, organic matter, fertilizers, etc. So as long as it's within the same system, that translocation can be still happen. Then we also have transformations, which refer to changes in place. So that's when something like weathering, right? So we talked about mineral weathering would be one example, which it's not leaving or anything like that. It's just changing the way that it looks in that spot. Similarly, something like compaction would be changing the way that the soil looks in that compacted area, or freezing would be another example. The water that's there is suddenly changing from a liquid to a solid. Now, interestingly, the same type of material can undergo all of these different processes. And in fact, all of these can be happening at the same time. So, for example, you could have organic matter deposited on the top of the soil. You could have a plant die and it falls on the top. And there are a couple of things that can happen to it. So remember, a couple of weeks ago, we were measuring CO2 loss. So that's a way that that organic matter could be lost. That organic matter then can also be moved down within the soil. It can be broken down a little bit, transformation, and then it can be translocated deeper in the soil. Similarly, things like clays can be deposited and they can leach out of the soil, and they can also just move down deeper into the soil profile, or they can change entirely into a different form of clay. Remember, it can go from 2-to-1s to 1-to-1s to iron and aluminum oxide. So all 4 of these soil forming processes can be happening in the soil simultaneously and at different places within the soil profile. So real quick, I want to zoom in and spotlight on toposequences, or another word we have for them is catenas. Now, we give these toposequences a special name because back in like the 1930s, soil scientists started to notice there's this regular pattern of soils across the landscape. It was usually in reference to where they were on a hill slope, but they started calling them catenas. And this was originated kind of in East Africa. So there was a lot of work done in Uganda and Tanzania and Kenya here, just kind of Central East Africa. They noticed these catenas. So how does a catena work? What does it look like? Well, first off, we have a slope. This is the soil surface here. Now, along that slope, we have specific position that we like to denote. So at the top, we have the summit. Then as we go down a little bit, we have what's called the shoulder. Then, of course, we have the back slope, the foot slope, and the toe slope, right? So we're moving kind of down the body of this slope. So we have the summit, shoulder, back slope, foot slope, and then at the bottom, we have the toe slope. Now, along that slope, we have a different depth to parent material. So at the summit, we would expect to find our deepest soils. We have a lot of distance between the top of the soil and where the parent material is. Then as we go down the slope, we start to have erosion happening, and the depth between the soil surface and the parent material gets thinner and thinner until in some places, parent material is what's at the soil surface. Then as we get down the slope again, we start to have a thicker soil depth, because the stuff that's eroded from the top here goes all the way down and ends up here. Now, there's also regular patterns in terms of the water table. So this here is our indicator of the water table. So you can see that the water table here is really far from the soil surface. That's because in the summit, it's super well drained. In the shoulder, it's less far because the shoulder is only, say, moderately drained. Then as we go down the slope, we end up having where the water table is basically at the soil surface. So these would be waterlogged soils. So then what happens is we get these regular patterns of drainage, right? We have well drained all the way to very poorly drained at the toe slope. We also have changes in soil depth across this catena, both overall and the depth of the topsoil. And then there are these regular patterns of weathering, right? We have erosion happening. When you have waterlogged soils, there are specific things that happen to it. We'll learn about that later, but just know that a catena will give you these regular patterns of soil formation, so much so that we gave them a specific name. Now, we'll talk about erosion a little bit more in lab, but erosion is also something that's really important here in Missouri. We've got a lot of steep slopes, et cetera, and we get a lot of really good rainfall and very intense rainstorms. So I want to talk a little bit more about erosion. It plays a pretty important role in soil formation here. So the first type of erosion is called rill erosion. So rill erosion is these tiny, not really tiny, but these small kind of valleys here that form. And those are kind of small. The water droplets start to come together and they flow downhill, and they form these channels that we call rills, and that's rill erosion. In between rills is called inter-rill erosion, where the water just kind of flows over it. But then when you have rills, they eventually come together to form what's called gullies. So gullies are big. That's our second type of erosion, but gullies are big, like a channel of water movement. Our third type of erosion is sheet erosion. Now, rill erosion still leads to sheet erosion. So we have two examples here. So we have rill erosion, where you can see where those slight preferential flow paths happen. But then what happens is, as those preferential flow patterns keep happening, all of a sudden you get this massive set of soil particles that just all detach kind of at the same time. And once they detach, they're moving, and that sheet, all of this stuff moves together as a sheet, and you see that topsoil is just gone. So that's sheet erosion, where the soil comes off in sheets. Now, we'll explore this a little bit more in lab this week, but just wanted to introduce you to the three types of erosion. Rill erosion, which can lead to gully erosion, or you can have rill erosion leading to our third type, which is sheet erosion. Okay, so in review, when we want to study the isolated effects of each soil forming factor, we use a sequence, which is when we let one of our soil forming factors vary and all the other ones are held constant. So we have climosequences, where climate is a thing that's varying. We have biosequences, where the dominant organisms are the thing that vary. We have a toposequence, which is where the relief or the topography varies. We have a lithosequence, which is where the parent material varies. And then we also have a chronosequence, when the amount of time varies. Now, certain geologic features lend themselves to specific types of sequences. We talked a little bit about this. So, for example, a glacier retreating gives us a nice chronosequence, because we know when the glacier was in different places, and it's retreating at a fairly consistent rate. So that would be a chronosequence. Similarly, when we have a hill, we know that the topography is varying, so that would be a toposequence. Now, we rely on those toposequences so often, and have studied them so well, we gave them a specific name called catenas. And catena refers to these regular configurations of soils within the broader landscape. So we found lots of consistent patterns of different soils across a landscape according to their landscape position. And that happens because of patterns of erosion, right? We have soil eroding from the top of the slope to the bottom of the slope. There are also differences in drainage across the slope, where the top of the slope might drain better than at the bottom of the slope, which is more waterlogged, poorly drained. And then there are also changes in chemistry, changes in weathering, and changes in depth to the parent material. these are somewhat predictable patterns that we can see happening over and over and over in varying contexts. Now, those patterns happen because of 4 soil forming processes that are at work. Now, those four soil forming processes are addition, which is when more things are added to the soil. We have losses, which is when part of that soil leaves the system. Then we have transformation, which is when something within the soil just changes the form, but it doesn't move, just stays in place. So that, for example, is the weathering of clays from 2-to-1s to 1-to-1s to iron and aluminum oxides. Then we have translocations, where things stay within the system, but they change where they are in that. So for example, you can have clays that move from the topsoil to the subsoil. So that would be a translocation. And when we have translocations, we have the zone of eluviation, which is where things leave from, and the zone of illuviation, which is where the things end up. All right, thanks so much. See you in lab.